Okay, welcome to the listening. Aerin Dunford. How are you? This fine day. It's morning. Is it morning where you are? What time?
It's midday, right in the middle of the day, 12
Midday.
o'clock.
Okay,
Yep.
so what? We're 6 hours between us. And you are, where are you in the world? Tell us where you are.
Yeah, I live in Oaxaca, Mexico, which is the southern part of Mexico. We're about 6 hours south of Mexico City. If you look at the geography of Mexico, it's kind of like a backwards J, and our state is kind of the bottom of that J, and then we're in the capital city of Oaxaca.
Right. Wow. And what sort of temperature is it there now? Kind of
It
average.
is very hot.
Is it?
Um,
Wow.
yeah, it's the beginning of the dry, hot season. So I think yesterday was about 31 degrees in
Mm.
centigrade, which is like in the upper 80s in Fahrenheit. Yeah, quite warm and very dry. Very, very dry.
Does it ever get cold there where you are? Not really.
Cold is relative,
Yeah.
but yes,
All
it
right.
does.
What's cold for you then?
Um, I'm gonna say that in December, January, and it's quite sudden. And even these last few weeks here, it's been getting quite cool in the evenings and the night. Like, you want to put a blanket around you, kind of cold.
Right.
But there's no heating or anything. So I'm gonna say like the coldest that it probably gets is into the teens in centigrade and like in the 40s Fahrenheit. Like that's pretty cold for here.
Wow. So you must like the heat then, if that's kind of as cold as it gets.
Um, I mean, I've been here in Mexico for 12 years. I'm originally from the United States and from places that generally are quite cold. So snow and winter, all of that was like very much a part of most of my young adulthood life and childhood. Uh, I didn't really choose to move to Mexico. I came here because I fell in love with a Mexican person. And so here I am. And I've adapted to the heat. I think particularly this phase that we're about to enter into, which in the northern hemisphere, like the more temperate climates, is seen as spring,
Yeah.
it is not my favorite time of the year. It's just yeah, the really really hot dry parts where it doesn't rain at all. It's quite difficult for me. The rest of the year here in Oaxaca, anyway, is quite beautiful. So it starts to rain pretty much every day if we're having a normal rainy season in around June, and that can last until October, September, October, and then it's just very beautiful and green and cools down and just a lot more moisture in the air and in the ground. And then yeah, it gets a little chillier in the winter, December, January, February, and then it's pretty sudden, kind of like hot.
So when you go back to the States, if you go back in the winter, it must be quite a shock then, right? Have you been
Yeah.
go back much?
Well, before pandemic times, I'm coming up on a year since the last time I was on an airplane. That's next Tuesday. It will be a year since I flew. I pretty much would go back to the States like once or twice a year. I've done some work up there in the last 6, 7 years, and so I was going kind of every 6 months or so. I mean, it is a shock, and I think it's interesting the way that your systems can adapt to a new climate, basically. And then I sort of feel that I lost that resistance that I had to the cold. Um, the funny thing is every time I go to see my mom, they live in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is where I grew up, and she's like, "Wow, you always have the same clothes." And I said, "Well, mom, it's just because I only really have like one set of sweaters and long sleeve things and you know what I mean? It's just not part of my normal attire anymore." So yeah, it's a bit of a shock. But I miss it too, particularly this winter when there's been so much snow in North America, and so I've seen all these beautiful pictures of like winter landscapes, and I miss that feeling. It's kind of that cozy, go inside
Yeah,
yourself
yeah.
sort of
The
feeling.
contrast
Yeah,
between the cold and being warm inside. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it is nice. I like that. We had a bit of snow here this year as well, so and the kids love it. Obviously, it's kind of super exciting. when it happens. So yeah, wow. So what's kind of live for you right now? What's really sort of going on, or what's kind of at the forefront of your attention in your life right now?
Hmm. Well, it feels a bit like there's so much at the forefront. Sometimes it's hard to kind of distinguish, like,
There's no
the
background.
right, the
Everything's
depth
at the
is like
front.
what's in the forefront. It's all right here. Um, maybe I mean I've been so I'm we know each other through a course that's called We Will Dance with Mountains, which we just completed the fourth iteration of it this January. And a lot of the ideas that came through that course this last iteration are very much alive for me right now. And particularly, so there's this work with Bayo Akomolafe, my companion, my brother from Nigeria. That work is very much alive, and some of the kind of like learnings that are coming through that, especially with the backdrop of the pandemic and everything that's happened this last year. And then the work that I'm doing with the Emergence Network, which is also with Bayo, who founded that, but kind of is taking on its own sort of tentacular life and going off into multiple directions. So some of the themes in both of those kind of worlds, which very much overlap. Um,
So
I'd
maybe
say
talk
one, yeah,
talk a little bit about the course and
yeah,
kind of what that
yeah.
was, and yeah, and maybe what did come up for you. That would be good.
Yeah, it's so hard to describe it. It's like I don't know. It started out about 6 years ago. Bio did the first We Will Dance with Mountains, and it started as a writing class because somebody was like, "Oh, your writing, it's so inspiring. It's so provocative. Why don't you?" Um, organize an online class where you can help people tap into that sort of like those deeper wells of creativity. But over time, it's really evolved, and even by the iteration that you were involved in 2017, Bio was starting to kind of play around in these areas around race and activism and indigeneity and like some pretty complex, entangled, and kind of hot topics, particularly for audiences in the global north, I would say, particularly the United States. And so I feel like what this course has evolved into is more of it's like a creative journey that we're going on together to explore these themes of what we would call post activism, which is the best way I have of describing what we mean by that, not as something that's beyond or better than activism. It actually comes out of a term that Bio created, which was compost activism. So rather than like fighting for or fighting against, like what happens if we just allow the system that's already obviously like in decline to fall apart? What new energy, nutrients, are created? So we're kind of exploring um, through this. It's a 3.5 month course. Some of these ideas, and then other things that came up a lot in this particular iteration were around sanctuary. So it was called Let Us Make Sanctuary. What does it mean to be in the process of making sanctuary? Not as a destination or someplace that we arrive, but what's the creative, journey that we're taking, um, and what are the different forms that sanctuary might manifest in. And there was a lot of art, visual art, dancing, movement, music, and then also of course like there's the very academic intellectual side of it too, but kind of edgy around the language that we're using, and starting to yeah, be able to dissect and take some distance from our sort of like colonial developed modern perspective that tells us, this is the way that the world is. And what if we took a step back from that and started to try to understand, for me, more through the body and through the heart than through the thinking or the mind? Um, yeah, decolonizing the mind has been a really big theme for me the last year. And then this other thing that comes out for me is yeah, I really got in this course that all of these concepts, these words, these definitions, it's like all coming through here, you know. Even our somatic corporal experiences are oftentimes filtered through the head. And I'm really like interested in um, becoming more literate, I would say, in like the vocabulary of the body and the heart, not like trying to understand it, but how can I directly have these like sort of transmissions, or you know, this information that comes directly from the feelings or directly through something that you're making with your hands. So that's been really up for me the last few months. And then one other theme is was really like exploring the cracks. So if things are falling apart, if we're in a time of rupture, you know, rather than trying to patch those things back together in some sort of like Frankenstein trying to save the world, what if we were to kind of get lost down in the cracks and the crevices and the ruptures? What new might we discover in those dark places? Together, I think was another piece that felt very important. That we were like a community.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and the course was 600 people this time, as opposed to the
Wow.
last time we did it when it was like 80.
Yeah.
So that was also huge, an online experience with that size of group, which made me very nervous in the beginning. And in the end, it was like being in a little village. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot more opportunity for people to find other people and themes and explorations that resonated with them.
Well, that's interesting that it was such a big group. You know, these kind of, yeah, I haven't really sort of, I mean, I've seen kind of big things happen when people are doing kind of broadcasts more, or there's conversations and there's a huge audience, but where everybody is involved, um, that's a kind of whole interesting universe. This sort of suddenly, like you're saying, like a village appears, a sort of virtual village with people from all over the world, and they start doing things together. You know, I imagine this is going on right now all over the place. That's a completely new thing that's happening on Earth. Is that these sort of spontaneous gatherings, you know, with all different kind of intentions behind them, or you know, not as perhaps not as um, deeply kind of thought out as the course you're talking about, but this all these different ways of connecting are going on, which is really, really exciting in a way. And I think you're talking about something that I'm very much interested in as well, this idea of getting more into the body and the heart, and you know, like rebalancing um, our beings really, because we have been so up in our heads culturally in the West for so long now. And yeah, it seems like there's a lot of people remembering their bodies and rediscovering the intelligence in their hearts, you know. And you're saying that there's this issue of sort of filtering everything through the head. It's like we're relearning the language or the thinking. Like, how does the heart think? How does the gut
Mm-hmm.
think? You know, because they have their own languages, they have their own thoughts in a way. You know, we call them things like instinct or intuition or, you know, emotion, or but they have their own species of language. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems like this is a sort of, I know it's an ancient place that we probably spent a lot of time in our past, but it's like we're rediscovering
Mm-hmm.
bizarrely that we've got bodies and hearts, you know, and that they have something to tell us, or and they have things to do. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, I think for me the gut especially, it's much faster and quicker and smarter than my head ever could be. And it's, I don't think it's ever wrong about things, and it knows immediately. Sometimes it knows before something's going to happen, what's happening, or something about something. And that, I'm always amazed by that. The more I kind of tune into that now and listen
Yeah.
and follow. I'm starting. This is something you probably be interesting to hear what your thoughts or kind of experiences are on this. But I'm really starting to follow my feelings and my intuitions a lot more than I used to. I'm listening and I'm noticing more when I'm
Hmm.
being told something by my
Hmm.
body or my heart, and I'm learning to kind of act on those things now, and it's producing some really interesting results. And I'm beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, inevitably, it's like someone giving up smoking. I'm trying not to kind of dislike the mind or reject it, or
Right.
you know what I mean? Because there is a tendency to just like throw all of that away because it's useful. It is useful,
Totally. Yeah.
but
Yeah. No,
way,
completely.
way out of balance, and it's been
Yeah.
used far, far too much. Uh, and for me, I feel like it's the main reason why we've created such a mess of the environment,
Hmm.
because the environment is our body extended, and
Hmm.
because we lost touch with that, that's how we could create such a mess and do such harm, because we just weren't feeling it in our bodies, you know. So,
Totally.
yeah. So what? I mean,
Yeah.
what? Yeah, talk a bit about that more, because that does interest me a lot.
Well, a few things come up for me. One is that I feel like the gut is sort of still an unexplored frontier for me a bit, and I know that there's now all of this kind of evidence, right? Scientific evidence, right? That the gut, because all of this stuff about like how the gut is another brain, and I don't know that much about that yet, but I find it really interesting that we, for a long time, I mean, who knows how long this metaphor goes back in history, but that idea of trusting your gut, that I think I anyway always thought, oh, well, that's just like it's an idea, it's a way of expressing this sense of intuition or instinct, but to find out that actually, you
It's
know,
the
the
thing.
gut is a brain, it's like a real thing, that's not just a figure of speech, you know, it's like whoa. um and I feel like I still have a ways to go. You know, I feel like I'm kind of starting with my feelings, because that was the place where a few years ago I started to realize what happened to me was actually I'd been doing, you know, work with the body and somatic practices and that kind of thing for a while. And I was really kind of, yeah, I mean, I talked a lot about the wisdom of the body. I taught yoga for many years, you know, but I realized like 6 years ago that I was intellectualizing all of it. That I actually wasn't dropping down into the body. It was the idea of the body having wisdom that I was working with. And so that's been a big shift. And at the same time, I realized how dissociated I was from my feelings. And so for me, that's been the entry point, is like how to stay with all of the emotions and not need to make sense of them, not try to organize them, not try to hold them down or hide, you know, behind this sort of like socially acceptable mask, or trying to please everyone by never being, um, yeah, overly emotional. And that's been quite a journey. But the gut stuff still feels like, oh, I've got some exploring to do there. And then the other thing that that reminded me of was exactly a year ago today, in this last trip that I took. We went to Costa Rica for the first time, my husband and I, and we were at some. I mean, it's just such a beautiful country, and we had these days that were just incredible with the nature and the animals and just everything. We went to some hot springs, and I was sort of like laying on these lava beds in these hot springs, looking up at the trees and having this realization that maybe is silly, you know, maybe that everyone realizes. I don't think so, but like, oh, when we say that the plants are our ancestors, that's not a metaphor. That's not just an idea. Like the plants came here and then we evolved, you know, and they know so much. And I had this thought that, speaking of the vocabulary of the heart or of the body or the hands, like maybe the way that the plants speak to us is through feeling. Like the vocabulary is actually emotion, you know. And I was just having this beautiful experience of being able to communicate with these trees through the way that I was feeling. And maybe that sounds really hippy
No,
dippy. But it was a really, it was a huge revelation for me that so many of these things that we talk about, whether it's trusting the gut or our plants or our ancestors, for so long I just kind of took that as something that was like an idea. And when we start to like incarnate those ideas, I feel something new starts to come up. And then the other thing I feel that really what you said sparked in me, and I think this is related to We Will Dance with Mountains and the work that Bayo does, is we're so supported in our existence on this planet, actually. And if we can, start to depend a little less on the logical, analytic, colonize the mind, we'll start to see how the ecosystem, the earth body, yeah, like just support that we have when we open ourselves to the idea that the human isn't the center, isn't the pinnacle. The human agency isn't the only agency at play. And I feel like so much is more is possible when we open our, I don't even know, our perception to that, or just open ourselves to the possibility that we're not all alone, a species fighting for survival. There's a lot more going on here than we're used to acknowledging.
Yeah, that isolation. I mean, that's kind of what it is. We've cut off 2/3 of our body in a way, essentially, and we've been isolated in this one bit, which is this abstract world of thought, and everything seems threatening and distant and other when you're in that place. But it's interesting you talk about feelings being the way to communicate with plants. That really, yeah, that opened a little door for me because I was wondering, because I have all kinds of relationships with trees and plants where I live here. But next time I'm outside, like tomorrow when I go outside and I'm around things, I'm just going to notice my feelings a bit more because why not? I mean, it's funny that we've got so reliant on science to tell us how reality is when we actually are having experiences all the time, which are directly communicating how it is in the world.
Exactly.
Completely directly, not interpreting and turning into thought and then explaining. Every child knows everything there is to know about being alive just by being present to it. And then we kind of abstract it and start to reinterpret it. And in a bizarre way, we kind of misunderstand it. So our acquisition of that kind of knowledge is like a kind of acquisition of dumbness because we're getting further away from how it really is. It's yeah. So why not? We're so enmeshed in the web of life. We're exchanging all the time bits of us and bits of them and bits of everything. And depending on the level you look at it, we are just one big living thing. And we're completely related to everything evolved on this planet. It all came from tiny little cells in water originally and created all this life. So we're completely family. And these are not just hippie ideas, these are scientific truths, if you need that translation. But it is a fascinating kind of idea to talk about or to explore. Okay, what if I just start to listen or be aware of or drop into my feelings more? And whenever I go somewhere and I'm around things or people, it doesn't even have to be people or even plants. It could be just around rocks or, small plants like grass or what am I feeling? And part of those, part of our sort of the things we take for granted, like, oh, if I go for a walk in a beautiful bit of countryside, I feel great. Well, what if it's because you're in that place and all these things are communicating that feeling and that's what you're picking up on? And maybe you feel great because it's like being at home with your family. It's like, oh, these are my people, these are my people and I'm with them and everything is growing beautifully and doing its thing. And this feels good because it's right.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps it kind of shows us just how bizarre most of the rest of our time is when we're not feeling like that because we're sat, looking at a screen or completely out of our body, not present at all in some other world. Because we've even gone beyond our thoughts now into some virtual space which isn't even in us, which is, again, it's a whole new universe, and it's almost like a fourth dimension. If you take body, heart, and mind, there's like this new dimension opening up now, which is this virtual space where other minds all collectively meet. And that's great. But if we can somehow harmonize and
Yeah,
bring, like, now we're talking, but I'm conscious of my body, I'm conscious of my feelings, and I feel like these kind of connections and conversations, if we're more present to everything else that's going on at the same time as our talking and thinking, we're having more of a conversation.
hmm
Our bodies are conversing, our hearts are conversing.
hmm
And that, I think this is it. As I'm saying it, I'm realizing that's what it is that fascinates me about these conversations, is that there's more going on than just words. It's not talking heads. It's not somebody, these are my ideas and opinions and I'm going to just broadcast them. It's feeling into the other person and what's going
hmm
on with them. And, and this happens, it doesn't matter that we're on different sides of the world. We can immediately, instantaneously feel something in our bodies. And I know you know this. You can make those kind of connections, and that to me is incredible. It's kind of instantaneous, and you could be anywhere in the universe and you could have that felt communication with someone because of how you're engaging with them, and how open you are to that connection, or how much you're noticing what's
that's
going
right.
on inside. you know
Yeah,
it's all just becoming more aware of who we actually are and what actually there is going on. There's nothing fancy, or you don't need to be particularly clever. You just need to pay attention.
that's
Quite.
right.
And I suppose this is what all the traditions talk about as well all the time. They're sort of saying it's right here under your noses. Just show up and have a look.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, two words that come up for me from what you just said, and I resonate so much with what you're saying, and even how I feel right now, like that tingly kind of feeling of like it's harmony, right? There's this sense of you're harmonizing with these parts of you, right, as a being, which actually what is, what's the membrane really? There are membranes, but we're all kind of just, yeah, we're one living organism. um and then also harmonizing with our surroundings, right? And the other word that I feel like is really present for me right now is this observation. So it feels like, yeah, what's happened in this sort of like post enlightenment, Newtonian Cartesian way of thinking about the world, right? Where humans are at the center and nothing else has any value except for what comes out of our brains. What it seems like we've done too is like complicate everything so much to the point that we have all this striation in our society is like who knows and who doesn't, this idea of exclusion and inclusion and the margins and the center. And like you said, it's all actually right here, so we don't have to go out and in my opinion, like study a lot and read a lot and be, very articulate with our language and our vocabulary. And I think if we can just really start to notice what's happening right here, but also kind of our relationship with the rest of the world, um, so much just becomes, we just learn, we learn from ourselves and what we are rather than from outside ideas about what we should be. So that feels very powerful to me. And we had an opportunity to listen to a young woman who's been deschooled, about 16 years old, as part of the We Will Dance with Mountains class. And her mom is a big fan of, undermining the educational system by deschooling her kids. And one of the things that she said, which just struck me so much, was that how even, at that age, she's developing this practice of observing herself. And she said, some days I don't really want to do very much. But even if I don't accomplish a lot, I can still feel like I've had a productive day because I've been in this space of observation. And the fact that at that age she's starting to realize, because I think one of the things the patterns that I struggle with as I look at myself is, yeah, growing up in a world where I have been socialized to believe that my worth as a being is dependent on my production and my doing and my accomplishment and getting accolades and praise and applause for that. It's been so hard to detangle myself from that story.
Mm.
And so the fact that this young woman is already in that process of observation, was so very, very inspiring for me. And I think that's something that's also very possible as we start to decolonize, deschool, kind of, yeah, remove ourselves from this modern paradigm that basically is telling us we're never enough, and that will fit in with capitalism, it will fit in with patriarchy. So I love that. And then there was one other thing. Let me see if I can remember. Oh, just that, um, yes, the virtual has all of its complexities and troubles and technology and the screen, but I just want to speak from my own experience that, and this, I have had magical experiences, and in this last year, because I was already doing so much on these platforms, a lot of people called upon me to help create these sort of spaces of deep connection, even though we're talking through a computer or a phone or a tablet. Um, and just remember that we're not just this,
Mhm.
and we're not just this when we come together. We're real people. We're having a real meeting, even though it's mediated through the virtual. And so I just feel, yeah, I mean, I feel both very optimistic about what's possible here, and I am hopeful that people have had those kinds of experiences in this time. And then there's all, I mean, I feel like it's starting to wear on me, the lack of physical connection. And I'm a facilitator and a host of conversations, and I miss that stuff. I
Mm.
miss coming together for a magical 5-day encounter with other people, where we can dance and move and hug and just be together. So I'm aware of both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, well, it's balance again, isn't it? It is incredible, this thing that we're doing, that we can do this, and I love it. I do love the technology for that. It's amazing, and it is enabling all kinds of new ways of connecting that have never happened before. So that is brilliant. And if we're doing it in an embodied way, if we're feeling and we're aware of our bodies as we're doing it, then we really are connecting physically in that way. Because that's what it is. We're communicating with all of us, and that's what's being felt. Because you'll have had this experience, I'm sure, where you'll be in a situation like this where you're communicating, and suddenly you'll both feel something, and you'll be feeling probably something quite similar, obviously through the kind of unique pattern and filter of your own body, but you can instantaneously feel something at the same time. That's real. That's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's being exchanged just like the thoughts and the words. So
Mm-hmm.
it's 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 really just a way of, again, noticing, of observing. So if you are observing all of what's going on in your body when you're connecting in this way, then the whole of you is connecting, and this just
Mm-hmm.
becomes, the only thing missing is those very physical aspects of when somebody's in the same room as you, all the kind of chemicals and the smell,
Mm-hmm.
all those things which only direct presence can bring. But a lot of the other stuff can get through, which is, that's amazing. I love that.
And just another little piece that I've noticed in this time of being so much online, which I was before anyway, too. I mean, I've been working with like translocal communities of practice for the last 16 years. So it's like wasn't, you know, a new thing for me, but I mean, I guess the exclusivity, a lot of the work being online now. But I've also been thinking, and as we were sitting here talking, I'm like seeing these little lavender flowers in my background, and then seeing the flowers, and I'm like, and maybe those flowers are needing to have a connection. Or I was taking a yoga class online at the beginning of lockdown, and I could hear the birds outside my window, and then I could hear the birds of my yoga teacher in her house, which is just in the next neighborhood. And I was like, and maybe those birds are needing to have a conversation through Zoom, you know, like just decentering the human. And so for me, the other piece that's really big right now is humbling ourselves before what we don't know and can't know. And then just that mystery of like, I don't know if the lavender is wanting to chat with your little, I don't know what they are. I think they're
Carnations.
carnations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe they're wanting to have a chat, you know, and the possibility that that could be the case without me needing to know is very enlivening for me. It's like, and it's also relieving. It's kind of like, oh, I, as a human being, I don't have to take responsibility for all of this, which I think is the other kind of the burden of of centering the human all these last centuries. It's actually very heavy. It's kind of a tough existence to sort of walk through the world with that burden. And if we start to see that we're just not the epicenter of everything, it lifts a weight from me personally in some way.
Yeah, this needing to know. There's such a pressure to need to know, and there's such a stigma around not knowing something. And it's such a small position because of course you can't know everything. We don't know, we know such a small amount of anything. Um, Certainly in intellectual terms. That's the irony of the intellect, is that it's the dumbest thing there is because it knows so little about everything. And whatever it thinks it knows, in 100 years' time, someone will come along and say, no, that's bullshit. It's this. And so on, right? So the only way of truly knowing is just being aware of now and what's coming in. That's true knowledge. I mean, it really is. And I mean, I don't know how true this is because it's been so mangled by our kind of interpretations and history, but I always was captured by this idea that seems to come from the Plains Indians of America, like the indigenous people that lived in the Great Plains, that they had this, or the kind of translation was the great mystery, that instead of God, which it kind of sounds like a thing or a person, there's just this idea of it's just the great mystery. And that, I always thought that was such a wise and advanced relationship with the divine or other, because it acknowledges completely that you don't know shit, that it's a total mystery, that it's beyond understanding in any of these ways even I'm talking about. It's much, much more. And it accommodates any eventuality. And to me that seemed like the most advanced way of looking at something. And it was then, I mean, I got into all of that, into that culture seemed to fascinate me maybe when I was in my early 20s. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, when the Europeans came to the Americas and thought that they were like civilized and they were kind of educating, and they were actually the barbarians, they were the heathens, because they'd met people who were completely in harmony with their environment and had a very, very profound and advanced relationship with the universe. And along we came with our fucking technology and self-righteous, ideas, thinking that they were savages. And it really struck me as early as that in my life. Oh my God, it was the other way around. And what excited me about American culture, as it was kind of, I suppose, as it was peaking, now that we realize that we're all in a bit of a decline period, is that what made America the most exciting and advanced place on earth was that it was this hybrid between these two cultures. Yeah, the white settlers decimated the indigenous population, but the culture is what made Americans Americans and not Europeans. So
Mm,
it is actually still living. It's a hybrid between the European settlers and the indigenous population. And that's what makes Americans Americans for me. And some of the most cutting edge cultural things that have happened in, the last 100 years, most of them have happened in America. And
when
it's
you
one
say
of those.
America, do you mean the United States or
I
do you
mean,
mean
I
all of
mean,
the
I mean
Americas?
both. I mean the whole thing.
Yeah, okay.
And I say white and indigenous, but of course you've also got the African mix from
Totally.
slavery, from and all of that mixed in is what made it happen. Think about something like jazz, one of the most
Yeah.
profound cultural innovations of the last 100 years, and it was where all these things met and kind of mixed together and something like that appears, which is amazing. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I love that yeah, on in historical terms, in sort of more superficial terms, I mean, not superficial if you were one of the people murdered or killed, but culturally quite superficial terms. Yeah, we came over from Europe and colonized and blah blah blah, but no, what happened was something far deeper than that, and it was a mixing. And those people that did arrive got changed forever by being on the land as well. The land itself
Mhm.
creates culture, changes the people, and the meetings with those indigenous people inevitably had an effect. Inevitably,
Mhm.
even in conflict, you can't help but pick up something. Even if you're destroying and annihilating a culture, you get infected by it because you've witnessed it, because you've seen things, because maybe even you just saw how they died, and the way they died maybe changed your thoughts about death forever because it was done in such a different way. Maybe there was a nobility in the way they were dying that kind of shocked you, that they weren't as desperate, or all of those things. I'm kind of making it up, but you see what I mean. There's so much goes on there, which
Mhm.
which to me is why America isn't like Europe.
Mhm.
North America now I'm talking about, or why South America isn't like Spain, or
Mhm.
Portugal, or because they mix together and the land itself
Yeah.
got involved. That,
Well,
and I
what's
think
really
that's
interesting.
cool.
Go ahead.
No,
I was just gonna say, so the other event from this last period of time that I'd love to mention, and then I want to talk a little bit more about what you're sharing here, because I think that this entanglement um, is a really interesting example of what at the Emergence Network we would talk about as sort of, yeah, the impossibility of predicting what will happen, and knowing that, I mean, that's kind of the whole concept behind emergence. And Bio talks a lot about entanglement and talks a lot about the way that we can't kind of extract ourselves from certain things, which would have to do with some of the crises that we're facing in the world right now. This question: what if the way we're responding to the crises is part of the crises? Or if we look at something like racism or genocide, and all of these issues that people, particularly in the United States, are like fighting against, but not recognizing the way that they're entangled in them. So we did this event. The Emergence Network held an event, a 5-day summit, virtual summit last year, called the Wilds Beyond Climate Justice. None of us are climate people, really. Some of us have that background, but it was more about bringing in indigenous leaders and elders and artists and people that probably don't consider themselves necessarily part of the climate justice struggle, but with this idea that inviting in other agencies, inviting in creative ways of relating to this, and seeing the way that we're embroiled in these issues. It's not like climate change and the people who don't believe in it are over there and we're gonna destroy them, it's, and that there's that, I don't remember what culture this comes from, but somebody, I think it was Daniel Four, has repeated it saying, the enemy of your ancestor is also your ancestor. And so this idea that, like, yeah, we're just so, we're intertwined. And I think that the example of the Americas, and I would use the whole continent, both continents, to talk about this. So one of the explorations that came up through the Wilds Beyond Climate Justice with the Spanish speaking group of us, some of us Spanish, like roots that settlers in the United States, others of us Northern European settlers, like have no, as far as I know, I have absolutely no indigenous background. It's like pretty pure Northern European blood, and others who, Venezuelans living in the UK, Mexicans living in, so we're kind of this weird mix. And through that exploration, we started to look at an amazing Bolivian indigenous anthropologist named Silvia Cusicanqui. And she has this theory that she talks about what's called like the cheje. And what she says is that the cultures actually didn't mix, that it's like, if you have a very intricate piece of art, and there's certain Andean artists that use this sort of motif where you put a black dot next to a white dot, and many, many dots, and they create this new color, right? So you have this gray that comes out from the juxtaposition, but that actually the indigenous and the European, they didn't like meld, right? In Mexico, this was a huge thing, and they used it to create a lot of patriotism around Mexican culture, which they call la raza cósmica, which is like the best of the indigenous world with the best of the European world mixing together to create. And it's like, that's just a mythology, for me anyway, that's a mythology that was used again by people who want to dominate with the intellect to create a magnet for the masses. Like, join on, we're Mexico, it's the raza cósmica and we're the best. But really, it's actually much more interesting than that. It's this idea that they were sitting these two cultures next to each other, and that from that juxtaposition, even though they're not mixed, they're still related, something new emerges. I find that fascinating. And so we've been meeting ever since last June, just exploring in our own lives, like, what is cheje? And the other metaphor that Silvia uses a lot is the idea of being spotted. And it's like, in Spanish, you would say manchado. So that you've become dirtied, but not getting rid of the pejorative sense of dirty. Like, and I think this is something else we talk about in the Emergence Network a lot, and Bayo refers to, is we're not pure. There's no purity here. There's no final destination that we're trying to arrive at, right? So we're spotted by the different influences that we've had. And rather than trying to like scrub ourselves of those spots, what if we explored their textures and their contours, and started to understand more what it means to be entangled, basically. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but what you were saying about the Americas is really fascinating.
And it's kind of obvious though, when if you pull back the focus over time, you realize that all cultures have emerged out of places and mixed and separated and mixed again, and it's been going on endlessly. There is no, it's ridiculous even to claim that you're European or white or anything, because you're made up of so many different ingredients over time. Ancestrally, you're related to everybody in that way. Again, it's the same thing like the plants. We are just an extended family. I mean, and this is not like a hippie idea either. It's fact. It's scientific fact. You can't deny it. If you follow all the lines back, they all meet up. So, and it's going on. It's a living thing. All these things are alive. So everything is alive. Culture is alive. Language is alive. It's never stopped. It's always moving. It's always Emergence is happening. That is the natural state of life. It's constantly flowering new things all the time. That's the nature of it. That's how it is. Just as we are, as people, as our cultures are, and that sort of fits with that idea of, if you accept that there's a mystery, first of all, big relief. Don't have to be responsible for the entire universe anymore. Whew. Thank God for that. There's that, but then there's also this idea of, oh, I'm not a fixed thing, and my people are not a fixed thing, and nothing's a fixed thing. So we're just flowing. So we're in this river, and it's moving all the time. And there are patterns in the river that kind of wobble a bit, but then they shift. Maybe the stone on the riverbed moves a bit, and then the pattern's gone, and then another one forms somewhere else. And this is how it is. This is how all of it is. And that letting go of the control, which is what we're talking about, really, that loosening your grip on needing to know, on having to be certain of who you are. If you can just loosen the grip a little bit, and allow the natural flow to happen, it's so much richer. It's so much more relaxing. Possibilities, opportunities suddenly emerge. You're talking about the cracks. This is how we should be feeling about this. Yeah, we tried and tried and tried in all our different ways to change what we knew was broken. But now we're realizing it's broken. Let it go. Let's rather concentrate on growing those green shoots in the cracks, in the compost, in the shit that's falling down from the old. Let's recycle it, and let's take the best of it. Let's take the bits that still are good and strong, that maybe have lasted for thousands of years, and we'll rebuild. Imagine like an old temple has collapsed, and then the villagers come and they take all the stones and they go and build their houses. Maybe the corner of your house has got a huge bit of stone from the temple. We can do that with culture. We can do that with our own civilization as it crumbles. We can take those big stones that are beautiful, that were great creations, and we can reuse them and build something else with it. This shifting, as I'm talking, I'm realizing this, just shifting the way we're looking at it makes things possible. What makes it possible for us to escape this trajectory of doom and gloom, which is threatening to pull us under more than anything else. I feel like if one thing this pandemic showed us was how fucked we are mentally, and that the actual virus wasn't a big deal, our reaction was showing how mentally ill we are as a culture. And we really need it. We wanted it to be a disaster in a strange way, so that we could actually finally go, oh, here's that thing that I've been worrying about all these years. We could actually put all of that worry into something rather than it being in us. I really feel that's what's happened. But instead of that, now we've done that, how about now we just kind of find ways to let go, so we can free up all that space for our creativity to marry up with our hearts, which know what to do. Everybody in their hearts knows what's right. Everybody knows that we should be taking care of each other, the environment, doing the right thing, not chasing the money, not destroying the environment for profit. Everybody knows it. Even if they're involved heavily in it, they all know it in their hearts, right? So we have that wisdom within us. We've just got to kind of free up the grip a little bit. And I think it's being forced by circumstances. And as we talk like this, then this is what I love about conversation. It's so creative, because as we're jamming, these ideas appear out of the mix between us. This is emergence.
Yeah.
I'm rambling, but this is how it works.
I love it. This is how it works. Well, a couple things come up for me as you're sharing this. I think what's interesting to me, this idea of the great mystery is very much alive for me right now. We had a chance to go out with some friends that I haven't seen for a while, after kind of being in quarantine for some weeks here. And I did have a couple of cocktails, I will admit that. But I was also just like, I was taken by, and these are pretty, can be relatively heady people, although I feel like they're steeped in some of these ideas, but a lot of it comes through the intellect, right? I was just I was crying at the table talking about how we have to humble ourselves before the great mystery, because I just feel like there's something there, right? And that doesn't mean that I believe that we are saved. I don't know, I do have some of that doom and gloom in me, or rather, like, I have a sense of empathy and curiosity about the people, like the deep adaptation people, right? The folks who are doing this stuff. Like, if we're doomed, if we're really, this is it for human civilization and mostly all human beings, what then? Rather than trying to perpetuate this idea that we as human beings can save, that first of all, we're the ones who've totally screwed up everything, and that second of all, we're the ones that will be able to fix everything on our own using our heads, right? I'm interested in those things, and I think that that's possible. I don't discard that possibility, amongst many others. But I feel like if we don't acknowledge, just how little we know, how big the great mystery actually is, we're probably not going to get far. And yeah, I don't even remember what we were talking about over our cocktails, but I was really impassioned, like, just feeling, my heart was really feeling that that's true. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember, I was feeling kind of coming more from my head. I was feeling some of that stuff, that the biggest challenge we face is our discomfort with the unknown. And so as a species, socialized in this way of the intellect, and we have to know, and we have to have a plan, and we have to be able to project, and we have to have strategy, and we're suddenly thrown into a situation where we don't know, and we just freak out. It was, and I live that too. I realize that I'm great at talking about being uncomfortable with the unknown, and not awesome at doing it. So I'm practicing in my own way to, on a little scale, what is it. Yeah, and I love that. I'm just seeing now in this conversation the way that conversation about how we're so uncomfortable with the unknown has now kind of evolved into this relationship with the great mystery, which feels so much more generative to me right now. It's like, oh, this is the way it is. And I can feel that in my heart and in my body. Whereas before it was kind of like the unknown as this like cold, scary frontier sort of space. And that's just totally transformed into something different now a year later. It's really exciting, actually.
Yeah, because you're acknowledging that you are part of that mystery, that it's actually just a part of you, this greater you. And it's death as well. Death, of course, the great mystery, and death, they're the same thing too. Because ultimately that's what we're afraid of. That's why we behave in such bizarre ways, because we're trying to accommodate this total cultural inability to deal with death. So, and the two things are, once you release into that and let go of that and just go, well, I'm going to die, and everything is a mystery, and I don't know anything. There's a tremendous sense of release in that, and ironically, there's a kind of knowing comes out of that, and a kind of security, the security you were looking for in trying to do everything you could to prevent something from happening, can actually be found by just allowing it. It's a weird paradox, I feel, that there's something so deep in that.
Yeah.
Oh, and you're talking the emotional thing. Like, I'm just constantly crying. Like, I'll be going along, I'll be driving along, I'll be playing some music, and a song will come on, and I'll just start crying because it's beautiful, because the sun's shining, because my daughter's 8 and she's just kind of smiled at me in a certain way, or and I'm constantly filling up, and it's like it feels like, I mean, it could be personal, it could be my age, like I'm getting older. I think men as they get older, they kind of their hearts kind of fight their way out and open up more. But it feels like there's so much more to feel right now as well. Like, and I guess because I've been exploring my heart for a long time, and I am a heart person by nature, it's so prone now to just feeling some grief or some beauty, and just and just saying something. It says something by creating tears, or because it has something to say. It's like, like you'll think of something, or your mind's constantly chattering. Well, now my heart's like, hang on a minute, I've got something to say. I want to say joy, I want to say tears, I want to say rage, or whatever it is. So I like that, as we're talking, I'm realizing we're all being open, we're all being pulled out. And if we're not fighting to hold on, if we're allowing that, there's something energizing in that. There's something exciting and inspiring, and it's kind of like the opposite to the fear and the doom, and that even if we are all going to die, that's okay, because we are individually all going to die anyway. So what's the worst that can happen? Well, I'm gonna die
Right.
anyway, right? So and the whole species will die, because that's the cycle of life. It's so much
Hmm.
bigger than humans. And it's
Hmm.
it's real kind of arrogance for us even to think that we are destroying the earth. We're not destroying the earth. The earth is a whole thing, and it gave birth to humans, and it created nuclear energy and internet porn, and those things all came out of the earth just like dandelions did. So humans didn't do anything. They're just part of a huge complex mystery that's doing its thing. And I mean, that's the kind of, there's paradox in there too, because yeah, I'm self-responsible, my actions do have an effect, but also I'm part of some huge orchestrated mystery that I will never understand, that is driving me just as sure as my own ideas are.
Hmm.
So the two
Yeah.
things are happening at the same time, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a part of me, and this gets into like some sort of sticky territory and it also reminds me a bit of the conversation about, um, you know, we're all interconnected and where we all come from, and I think that there's still a need to like recognize, accountability, responsibility, whether we're talking about, genocide, slavery, the destruction of a planet, like there's different levels of this. And so I do, and I think the experience that we had in the class that we did together was sort of like these identity politics, this is the right way to do things, and we have to be inclusive, and we have to be fair, and we have to have equity, and like that narrative sort of can bump up against this other one of we're just, small beings that are part of this bigger thing. And I think one of the things I'm really interested is like learning how we can navigate that space in between those two things, because I feel like there's a response to some of these ideas that we're all interconnected, that we're all indigenous to some place, that we all originally came from Africa, that is, I would say, bypassing, right? But what I feel like is interesting, especially just coming out of what we were talking about, the heart, it's like we need to feel all of the feelings that brings up, right? And it's not to say everybody with European heritage is evil and we should feel shameful and we should feel, that isn't going to help us. But I think that there is this tapping into a place where it's like recognizing on an individual, on coming from this heart right here, I feel, pain and sorrow and grief and about what my ancestors did, right? So not in a way that's like a burden to carry, but more in this sense of, and I love the way you talked about how your heart is just wanting to speak these days. Like, I think that by tapping into those feelings and taking down this mask that we've been told that we have to wear, and that I think is there in like the very kind of hippie new age, we're all connected, we're all one story, as much as it is in the social racial justice movement space that says, you have to go out and fight against all of these wrongs in the world. Both of those have masks. Any community or group of people, we learn how to put the mask on. And it feels to me like what the times are calling for now is to take that down. And so when we let our hearts express, when we go deeply into those feelings that may come up around some of these issues, my therapist once said, like, nobody can tell you that you don't feel something, right? So we can argue and say, you said this and you said that, and you're wrong and you're bypassing, or you're too this or that. But nobody can deny when I say, I feel sadness or grief or anger. Nobody can tell you, like, no, you don't feel that, So there's just something really powerful in these times, I feel, about being able to really let that heart speak, right? um yeah, it feels like we're being invited into a time where our mouths and our throats actually become sort of the passageway, not of our thoughts and our ideas and our great solutions, but more the intricacy and the generativity of our feelings. Yeah, that's been very
Yeah, the
powerful for
truth
me.
of that, the truth of those
Yeah.
feelings, and as in this moment, because all those things are stories that we kind of get confused and complex, complicated with, and we're all just kind of talking and getting upset about stories. If we come to
Mm-hmm.
now here, that's where it's happening, and in that place, the truth of what you're feeling, of what's going on, is revealed, and everyone gets access to that same truth. That's where I feel like I want to be more there, because that's where the answers to any given moment or situation are to be found. And that it's a sort of shattering of all of history that's kind of creating all this noise and fury and anger and polarization. Just, it's like a whirlwind of shards of the shattering of culture that's whizzing
Mm-hmm.
around, and if you get caught up in that, you're lost. So you just have to sink right down into now, into your feeling, your body, into your heart, and then from that place, any thoughts that come up might have a chance of really communicating something to somebody, or any words that need to be spoken, or even just a look on your face, or an action of your body, or something far more subtle that you're not even visibly aware of, maybe gets communicated, a feeling in a space, or that gets transmitted. That's where that's where we need to meet, all of us, right now, because all of the answers, if we are going to make it through and find a way through, the answers to those questions that we need to be asking are found in the moment, in the now, more than they're found in stories or
Mm-hmm.
books. Or we are the living books that we need to read. We need to read each other like a living book, like really meet somebody, not that meet the person you think they are, or the person that you think because of the things that happened last week, the week before, thousands of weeks, but who are they today? You know, that it's like a habit. And
Mm-hmm.
this sounds like kind of preaching something. I'm not. I'm just. It's just occurring to me that if we can develop a habit of doing that more, that's going to serve us far better than anything else. Because there are no solutions or ideas or big ideas, or it requires a completely different way of being, and it And the
Right.
only way is that I can see from all the wisdom throughout the ages, all of the wisdom always says it's about being here. It's just about showing up and noticing what is. And,
Hmm.
and it feels like the pressure to do that is increasing.
Yeah, and I think the counterpart of that, I mean, I totally agree with that, and I think it requires, that we as individuals take down that shield so that because we have to meet ourselves in that place first,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then we can meet the other, or another
absolutely.
entity. But I think the other thing, and you mentioned it has to do with practice, right? So it's the habits, and this is when I talk about the decolonizing of the mind. That's a little bit what I'm saying. Like I've started to realize that um, we think that we're coming up, and this is, just the scientific kind of method mind, or the, post enlightenment mind, is like we think we're coming up with these grand solutions that solve the problems that we face or create something new. But when those solutions are coming out of the same kind of thinking, right, where we're still the center, human agency is all powerful, we're just going to keep in this hamster wheel repeating these same patterns. And so for me, figuring out like very concrete, and maybe they seem ridiculous, but little experiments that we can do that are practical to help us just kind of subvert that rut. I think about it as like a synapse rut of like, we are so used to thinking in this way. It's come down through the generations. We were brought up in this way. And if I can just do little things to kind of throw a glitch into that system and go like, oh, I learn more about the way I'm thinking, and maybe I can adjust and experiment with other ways of thinking, which could include showing up in the now, making myself available for the person, being open to what wants to emerge. But I think that it requires practice, not practice in the sense of like practice makes perfect, but practice in the sense of like a martial art, or something
Yeah.
that we do, that we repeat, because yeah, I honestly, I think that the biggest, I don't know if it's challenge or intractable problem that we face, after this last year, it it isn't anything external. It's just really the way that we've been thinking, and the way that we've been so soaked in that particular system of thought that we think that there's no other way.
Mm.
And that is really what is screwing us at the end of the day. It's pretty ironic that we think that this has all the answers, when really this is what's preventing us from being able to do something different.
That's exactly it. And it is on that kind of meta level. It's like you need to change the whole process. And so the simplest thing is to just notice what is right now. I mean, and the irony in that is that it's the hardest thing in the world to do, and people spend years in ashrams trying to get there, but it's so fucking simple. That's what's funny. I mean, it's a comedy really, because it's so simple that anyone could do it in any given moment, and yet it's kind of, because of the nature of the mind and the nature of our habits, we make it hard. We do too much because it's about not doing
Hmm.
anything. It's actually the opposite of doing. It's just being. But that's too
Yeah.
simple, right? But that, that kind of it, and all the what's wonderful about that place, the place of being, of presence, is that everything you need to know is there.
Hmm.
It's like the library of the entire universe is available in that moment, and all the things you would need are in that moment. They're not anywhere else. You don't
Hmm.
need to remember
Hmm.
anything. They
Yeah.
come as part of the package of the moment. When the
Hmm.
moment arrives, it has everything it needs, and everything anyone who's there would need. um, it's kind
But
of,
doesn't that subverts completely the logic of capitalism? I think that's where like we have these clashes
oh
because,
yeah,
yeah. which tells
Absolutely.
us that we don't know, that we need more, that we aren't enough, you know. And so it feels like those are two ideologies actually like crashing into each other. And part of the reason that it's so challenging for us to just, you know, trust in the moment.
Yeah, well, because one, you haven't practiced it, you've not been taught to practice it, it's not been woven into your culture. You did it as a kid, and then everything was beaten out of you. It was, you were told that that was totally not what you should be doing, you know. So you were, you know, you knew how to do it really well when you were born. You were a master of the moment, and then you were slowly taught a way out of it. So, you know, that's the kind of the mystery of education and socialization. But, and also it's kind of, you know, that's sort of the journey though, isn't it? Like you started with it all and then you lost everything and then you have to find it again. That's the game. That's the game that we're all playing. Um, yeah, and it's, you know, it's fun sometimes and other times it's horrendous. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to just, I mean, this will be like, can kind of like, it'll be a good place to bring us to the kind of close of this
Yeah.
conversation, because I wanted to go back to the piece you brought up about death and endings, and closure,
Hmm.
um, which I think is such, I mean, it's a very, important theme for me. And it's actually interesting because my dad became very fascinated with death quite young, probably, you know, around the age that I am now. And started, you know, doing a lot of reading and working in hospice, um, and so I feel like it's a bit in it's also in my lineage, this conversation. But it feels like it also ties in so much to many of the other things that we've touched on in this conversation. And yeah, just what you said about our death phobia and our grief phobia, and the way that we culturally, at least from my experience, you know, from the United States, very Western, very modern education system and family system, um, we're just not given the tools to navigate death and grief either, or endings, even if we didn't want to make it, you know, about death. Someone was recently saying to me, going back to the opening of our conversation about being in the United States for the first time in maybe 10 years during the winter, and how interesting it was for her to notice this whole thing. And I'm imagining it happens in the UK too. Is like, oh, winter is coming. It's going to be terrible. We're going to have to endure, and it's going to be cold, and we're going to have to shovel snow. And I think that I think it's like lack of familiarity is almost how I would describe it. You know, maybe it's not a explicit phobia, but that this feeling of like we reject that which is, you know, ending and resting and hibernating and kind of and closing, um, is something that has been a great disservice to us in in our times, because there's this kind of constant drive for more and more life, more and more light, and preserving life perhaps to a point that has become actually kind of sick for our society, you know, in so many different ways, like human bodies for sure, but also just this idea of like pushing and pushing and pushing to keep things going when it's clear that it's time for an ending, right? A
Mm.
conscious closure. Um, and
Where
so,
the quality of life is so appalling that death would be better. And if you think about the response to the virus, where we've stopped life because we're afraid of death, where we've ended life, where everyone has to stop and be at home, that you can't, that's not living. That's not a solution. That, you know, that
mhm.
totally isn't a solution. And it's just an expression of the same thing, that an
Yeah.
incomplete, you just can't deal with death. So we stop. It's like freezing. It's like, stop, everybody hold on, hold your breath, and maybe it'll be all right. It's fucking crazy. We have to find a way to welcome death back in and make
Mhm.
it a part of life, because it's from what life comes out of death. It's the origin of life. We're missing
Right.
half of our existence is missing because we're not celebrating, incorporating, accepting death, that we carry it within us as a seed from day one, and it's growing. The flower of death is growing in your body from day one. We need to embrace that.
Right.
We need to, like, just because that's the richness of life, is that it is this
Right.
dance between light and dark, between death, between life.
Yeah. What was coming to me when you were speaking is also how, like, I think that when we can do death in a way that honors it, that's um, embracing like its role, that life is actually very much present with there, right? So if you're accompanying someone through through a deathing process, through a dying process, that's yeah, honors and embraces and brings in um that recognition that life will be there, right? That is part of it, the way that those
it's
two are
it's
intertwined.
really enlivening. It makes life more alive. That's what it does. I mean, it really
Exactly.
does, and it's powerful, and it's dignified, and it's noble, and it's so good for people because it cuts through all the bullshit and says this is what is, and it
Hmm.
makes you look at all your bullshit. It confronts you in a stark way. It's so powerful. It's such a
So powerful.
wonderful teacher. It's
Yeah.
so many different things, and many cultures have known and acknowledged that. I don't know what happened with us, why we ended up so far from it, in a way.
Hmm.
And of course,
Yeah.
and 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 because we're like that, what we don't realize is that we're hardly alive.
Hmm.
Our culture doesn't allow us to live the full extent of what it is to live because it's
That's
so
right.
safe and controlled, and stop it, and you must be in this narrow little channel. So we're not even living, is what's happening.
Mhm.
The moment we accept death, suddenly we have the fullness of life and lived experience, and it's so rich and it's so vast, that and we can really live, but it requires us to accept and take in death.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was even just thinking how, when we are in that space and we are seeing death there present with us, is a time when we're just in the now, right? I think that that is the perfect example of a time that everything else stops, because we know that this person or this thing, or it could be a project, or it could be your company or your organization, it doesn't have to just be about bodies,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That we can be like, this moment is precious because it isn't going to be here forever, but instead we're kind of with these blinders on and thinking that we can just like prolong life, prolong light, prolong the good, and it's true, it just starts to shrink up our experience, as living beings. And so that's like, I mean, constantly, I know you know a little bit of my story, that I became pregnant when I was 43 after being told I would never be able to conceive. And then that child died at 40 weeks of gestation. And so, that experience for me, it's been 2.5 years now. And it was so, I mean, it was horrible, and it was the most life changing, painful. And I'm still every day trying to figure out kind of how to navigate that experience. But I mean, living as a living person with a dead body, inside of me, it was literally like this seed that had died while it was still inside my body. And then giving birth to that, was to that body, to that, child no longer alive, was so, I mean, of course I'll never be the same, but I will never be the same on so many different levels, not just because that was traumatic or that it was a tragedy, or it's also like it it made it so that I could no longer put those blinders on, basically.
Yeah.
Um Yeah. And so I've started to actually think a lot more about, like, I've actually started, I hope my parents, maybe they'll watch this, but I've started to imagine, like, what will it be like when my parents die, because that will happen within the next, 15 years, I would guess. What will that be like? Like, really to imagine, not in an abstract way, but like, what will it be like to get that phone call, to get on that plane, to be at the funeral, like really feeling into that, not in a way that feels like morbid or terrible, or that it's stopping me from living, but because I feel like the way that we've mostly been socialized in this culture is to never think about that until it happens. But if we're not prepared for that, I feel like these systems that we're actually not able to take it in. We're not able to process it in a way that we're meant to, actually, that we were designed to hold those two things, in balance, but also in their inextricable entanglement, of those two, life and death, dark and light, endings and beginnings. It just feels so important. And if there's anything that I think, like, no matter what happens in the future for humans or the planet or the universe, if there's anything, any skill and any practice that I feel like we can develop more, it's really cultivating that capacity to be with death, to work with it, to be with our grief, to accept it, to share it. And yeah, I think no matter what happens, that is a field of practice where we'll need it. We're going to need it.
Amen to that. Yes. Well, that's us then, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's so great to reconnect with you. I feel like, I mean, I remember our conversations from several years ago, and your story, and it lives in my heart. It lives in me. The choices that you made in your life, and the way that those choices have reconnected you with different parts of yourself and the world around you. And so I just feel really blessed to have opportunity to reconnect in this way.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Well, we'll do it again. We'll do it again. Yeah, great. All right. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, your warm day. I'm kind of wishing for warm days now. But just by hearing 31 degrees, and it dry heat, I can really feel into what that is, and I can sort of enjoy it in my mind and my body from here.
Send
Oh,
through the Zoom.
yeah, I'm zoomed. I'm getting zoomed with heat. Okay. Well,
All
lots of
right,
love.
friend.
Take care.
Same to you.